Good morning. Welcome again. My name is Amrita Jayanthi, and I direct the Tech and Public Purpose Project here at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Thank you for joining us today for a special session in our Perspectives on Public Purpose Week, an event series showcasing our TAPP Fellows research and work. The TAPP Fellows, for those of you who may not know, are government, industry, and civil society practitioners that conduct field-based and solutions-oriented research on issues relating to tech and public purpose over the course of one academic year. The events this week will dive into timely topics such as the digital divide, deep tech entrepreneurship, platform urbanism, tech policy assessment, inclusive product design, and much more. I'll link the webpage with the full schedule of events in the chat. In this session specifically, Belfer Center Director, former US Secretary of Defense, and TAPP Faculty Director Ash Carter will provide brief opening remarks more broadly on what tech and public purpose is, especially as it relates to major events of this past year. He will then lead a discussion with our 2021-2022 TAPP Fellows to look at the role technology played this year in a few key priority areas: crisis management, consumer safety, inclusion and equity, national competitiveness, and the information ecosystem. We will also dive into ways we can improve the development and management of tech, providing a taste of each fellow's individual projects. I'd like to flag that we will not be holding a Q&A segment during today's session, so any questions posted in the Zoom Q&A feature will not be addressed live. Finally, I'd love to give a big shout out to Karen Ejiofor, TAPP's project manager, for leading the coordination of this week's events, as well as the overall fellowship program. So thank you all for joining us again today. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Secretary Carter. Thank you.
Well, good day, everyone, and thank you for being here with us. You're going to have the opportunity to hear today from some research performed by fellows of ours at really the cutting edge of technology and public purpose. I have spent a number of decades now at the interface of public life and technology, and became convinced that technology underlies the most consequential issues of our time. Why is that? The reason is that everything that's really new in human life, and therefore that really poses new challenges to human self-governance, arises, if you think about it, from technology, because it's technology that creates the new dilemmas that have never been seen before. It's technology that creates the new opportunities and the new capabilities that we never had before. It's technology that compels us to strike a balance between all the good things that can come out of human innovation and inevitably the dark side, either technologies that in their nature have a dark side, or that open up the opportunities for the worst in human nature to act out a dark side. So lots of bright things, but some dark things as well. The importance of finding solutions to these dilemmas that are posed by technology that constantly pop up, and you never know really where they're going to come from and when they're going to come. That's one of the wonders and joys of human invention. But what it usually means is that they're sudden, they're unprecedented, and you need to have people who are, on the one hand, capable of understanding the underlying technology, and on the other hand, committed to public purpose. There are a lot of other motives for pursuing technology in our society. The profit motive is the principal one that drives technology forward, and that's entirely appropriate. But you need people who are also motivated by a sense of public purpose. Why do I use the term public purpose rather than public policy? When I started the TAPP program, I deliberately began using the phrase public purpose to signify that finding solutions to technology's dilemmas is not just the business of government and can't just be left to government. Government's an important part of things, but since so much of the tech community and so much of the resources of technology and so many of the people involved in technology are in the private sector, it's also important that the private sector involve itself in creating solutions to these dilemmas. And therefore, if we use the phrase public policy, it would sound like we're only thinking about government laws and regulations and so forth, and also policies to promote technology, funding, laboratories, and so forth. But I think it's important also that those who work in the private sector, and we all have and do in our technology lives, take there also the spirit of public purpose. There's so much going on now, and you'll hear from some of our wonderful fellows a word from many of the frontiers. Let's start with the digital revolution. The digital revolution's been with us for 25 years now, if you date it to 1996 and the Communications Decency Act, as many do. A quarter century, that's not young. The interesting feature of the digital revolution is not only how all-pervasive and consequential it is, and unending as we go into the era now from just big data and social media and the internet and so forth towards AI and quantum and other frontiers of the digital revolution. It's not just that it's pervasive and hugely consequential in human society. The other thing that's been remarkable about it is that it has essentially been ungoverned for 25 years. That is, the country that gave birth to the digital revolution, namely the United States, decided to forego applying any public rules or regulations to the internet from the beginning. And for one reason or another, that has gone on for what is historically a very long time, that is a quarter century. That's beginning to change now, but it's a hard thing to change because it's an unaccustomed thing. So we have ahead of us the next chapter of the digital revolution and the first chapter of trying to come to grips with its public purpose consequences. And you'll see in some of our panelists today, they're grappling with various big aspects of that problem. The biorevolution is the revolution that is to come. That's a very different revolution in its essence. The fields of science that feed it, and also in the way it's treated by society, because it deals with human health. Generally, people are more accustomed to the idea that there's a common wheel that needs to be taken care of when it comes to the biorevolution. But we're just beginning to see that unfold. And you can keep going down the list. Radio frequency spectrum management, new forms of human conveyance, whether they're rocket ships or tilt rotor or maglev, all the different ways technology is changing that. The issues that arise from technology's impact on the workplace, where most of us spend maybe a third of our lives, what kinds of opportunities available to us and what it feels like when we're there, and how it affects issues of fairness and satisfaction and equal treatment. There are very big issues in all of these technological revolutions in the way that they amplify or refract issues that society has that arise from our nature and that are not new, but are simply newly situated in a different material context. I'm referring to things like economic inequality, issues of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and how they fit into the technological revolution, who benefits and who participates in the technological revolution. These are big issues. So lots of fields of developing technology, the digital and bio are the two big ones, but there are lots of other ones as well. And brand new issues that have never been encountered before, and old issues that have been around as long as humankind has been around and as long as people have struggled to live together and work together, but that suddenly take on a new form and become not necessarily more difficult to manage. Sometimes technology helps, but creates a totally new form for public purpose. So all this is going on around us in a year that has been filled with all kinds of titanic change. And with the war in Ukraine and with efforts to subvert American democracy, a global pandemic, difficult global economic circumstances, including supply chain issues and so forth, which are also tied to technology. It's been a year in which tech issues have been displaced in the headlines by other issues. And from my point of view, that means it's been a year in which we haven't made as much progress as we might have as a society in the broad field of technology and public purpose. I hope we'll catch up in the years to come. And the people who are going to help us catch up are the people you're going to see on the screen, your screen today. And I want to say something about each of them briefly, and then I'm going to take them in, there are 6 of them. I'm going to take them in the order in which I now introduce them. And then one by one, I'll tell you a little something about the importance of their work from my point of view, then ask them to describe their work and its importance. And then if we have time, I'll ask them a question or two. Our fellow, by the way, I should say something about our fellows. These are very talented, as Amrita said, people who have already done consequential things in life and have come here to the Kennedy School to develop their ideas and their thinking as they wrestle with creating solutions to one problem or another in public purpose. We here at the Belfer Center and the Kennedy School have 2 products of our enterprise. The first is ideas and solutions, and the second are people who will, in the course of their lives, go out and assume those leadership roles in areas of society that are affected by technology. And because they've had a time to reflect on those and get to know other people who are working on the same kinds of issues during their time here at the TAPP program, they're going to be better equipped to lead the world forward in an unending technological revolution. So I'm very proud of these folks. They came in great and they're going out even greater. And you're going to hear about their work. The order in which I'll take them are Liesl Bogan, Stephen Larrick, Francella Ocello, Avivo Vadia, Afsene Rigo, and Livio Valente. Liesl developed a very robust assessment framework to analyze the potential impacts of various science and tech-related policy legislation now pending legislation that she understands perfectly well, because among other things, she's written legislation like that when she was working herself in the United States Senate. And also to reflect upon the ways in which a busy member of Congress spread throughout all the huge panoply of issues that a modern legislator has to deal with can educate him or herself to participate in this technological revolution and do the responsible thing, which is help pass laws that bend the arc of technological change in the direction of greater net good. Liesl, in both of those areas, both looking at specific pieces of legislation, field you know perfectly well, and thinking about the general issue of getting good technological advice and assessment making that available to members of Congress. You've done some really important work this year. You want to describe a little bit?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yes, I went to Congress later in my career. I had the great fortune of being a Congressional Innovation Fellow, a Tech Congress Fellow, because the founder of that program recognized that Congress didn't have enough technology expertise within its walls when he was working there. And so Travis Moore, he created this program, and I did it later in life, which was designed for later career professionals. And what I discovered when I was there, one is that Congress does so much more than I think the broader public anticipates. And I had interfaced with public policy professionals and government officials prior to that for a long time, but it's very different once you're actually there and working on it day to day. And I was so impressed by my colleagues and many others in their grasp of the issues. But one thing that stood out to me and that I had the great fortune of reflecting on this past year is that a lot of the time, because of the speed and the many issues that are being thrown at members every day, you don't have enough time to necessarily think through the underlying assumptions of the things that you're working on. So you see a problem, you're trying to address it. So I had the opportunity to think about what are some of the assumptions that we are trying to address when we work and draft technology policy legislation, and how do we communicate that more effectively to members. And that can take a variety of different forms. It was a really interesting period of time. I focused a lot on the crises that we faced in the 116th, 117th Congresses, what they surfaced about technology policy, but then I zeroed in on digital information in particular, because as many have pointed out, we are sort of living in this post-truth era where individuals are no longer trusting the information they receive or the institutions. There's sort of been an erosion of trust. And so how do you start to build that trust back, and what are the mechanisms that we can use to do that?
So what, if you wanted to point to one takeaway that those who are attending this seminar might have, you've done a number of things, but just pick one and spin it out a little bit for them, Liesl, so they get an idea of what the work you've been doing.
Great, yes. So I kind of built a catalog of different technology harms as evidenced by the legislation that are being addressed, and then legal cases that have been decided upon, mostly related to Section 230 legislation. I also looked at the history of the way Congress has addressed, in particular, disinformation, but then later misinformation, which is distinct from it and often not always treated as distinct from it in the legislation.
Would you state the distinction for everybody, please?
Correct. Yeah. Yes. So disinformation is deliberately false information that's inserted into a society secretly through a state actor or some other nefarious actor who's attempting to kind of skew the conversation. Misinformation is simply false information that circulates unintentionally. And then malinformation, CISA has kind of put out a new definition that I talk about in the report. And that is false information and sometimes true information that's put within a false light. So it's skewed in terms of context. And then the other area that sort of developed over the pandemic, and it was originally coined in 2003 by David Rothkopf, but related to SARS, but it's infodemic. So the information is spreading, a lot of it's false, and it's doing so at scale, and it's really causing problems in terms of public health and other issues, and in terms of making decisions. So I looked at a lot of that legislation and a lot of the efforts dealing with those issues. I'd worked on those issues in the past. And what I found is that one way that Congress is trying to deal with the harms that come from all of these things is to try to create smaller offices or build capacity in the executive branch, or to try to create new tools and mechanisms for analyzing this type of information, or compelling companies to hand over more data so that they can analyze these issues. But because a lot of these things are so complicated and they're broad, towards the end of the research, we began proposing and floating around and discussing the idea of a Department of Innovation and Technology. And there have been many efforts to do this, but to do similar things. But the reason I think it's critical now is most executive branch agencies have been developed after a crisis. The SEC was created to try to restore trust and have Americans restore trust in the markets. I start with the Department of Agriculture, which was created during the Civil War, because it was reflective of the broader economy at the time. And given the way technology and innovation reflects our current economy, it seems strange to me that Americans don't have a place where they absolutely know that the United States government is addressing these issues. And granted, there are a lot of problems with these things, and we've thought a lot about them, but that's one of the sort of proposals that we've thought about in terms of what could come next to build resilience for the future in relation to these problems. Oh, sir, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, one of many good ideas that you've originated. And I'm sorry, we got to move on to Stephen now, but Liesl, thanks so much. Stephen Larrick. Stephen has been working on the issue of the digital, if you like, or technological, more broadly, governance of urban spaces. You've all heard of smart cities, and smart cities are one of these technological possibilities that has an obvious upside, but has an obvious dark side as well. And Stephen has been looking in that context at what the avenues are that we can use to pursue public purpose in the context of smart cities. You've seen phenomena where cities have just been overwhelmed by the pace of change. Companies moving in very aggressively and trying to outsmart and outmuscle and outmaneuver and outspeed government. And Stephen's been trying to think about how local governments can keep up and do their duty in the face of this onslaught. Stephen, tell us what you've been doing, and especially what your main product is. Now you're on mute. There you go.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, hello, everyone. And thank you for introducing my work. I am looking at cities and digital governance, and from the context of the smart city. I also I think transitioning out of some of the topics Liesl was mentioning, broadly, I'm looking at a topic that I think has received much popular attention and relevant to kind of this national conversation, that of digital platforms and how they should be regulated. And within the context of cities, as in so many other domains, cities are smaller and more agile and can start that experiment in some cases before we see action at the state or national level. And so in my case, I was looking at the landscape of new technologies entering cities and new approaches. And in around 2018, when e-scooters and micromobility companies started deploying fleets within cities, a new approach really started to become prevalent. And that was around requiring new technology platforms to share data with City Hall. And this started a broad debate around, on the one hand, tech oversight and kind of democratic accountability, and on the other hand, privacy and kind of private proprietary information, and under what circumstances should something like data sharing be mandated. And so I began to look comprehensively at this debate, and one thing that I saw as missing from the debate was an empirical look at the policies themselves, and a real kind of ground truth discussion with the practitioners in these various communities who were implementing these new programs. So I did a broad landscape assessment of that field. I looked at 3 different types of sharing economy platforms: short-term rentals like Airbnb and VRBO, ride-hail platforms like Uber and Lyft, as well as micromobility platforms, companies like Lime and Bird. And I looked at all of the city policies or local government policies that have required in some way reporting or sharing of data. And I tried to understand really what was going on there. And I think one big takeaway for me was this kind of, there has been presented this idea that there is a trade-off and we have to choose between privacy and democratic accountability. And I think my big takeaway is that there are a lot of different approaches to this issue, and we can have both. We can have responsible data sharing that allows local governments to protect the public interest, advance certain community goals, things like equity and accountability. We're seeing areas where cities are requiring tech platforms entering their public right-of-way or their domain to implement certain types of protections for consumer privacy, even outside of collecting data.
Hey, Steve,
so it's this interesting moment. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I just wanted to make sure you had time to describe the hub.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're right. You have found all of these examples of places and times when the balance has been struck between having the new and protecting the public purpose as well. And your central creation this year, this incredible hub, is a way of kind of, if I understand it right, bottling and packaging and storing and making available these best practices so that every town and every municipality doesn't have to go through the same trial and error process over and over again. Is that right?
Absolutely. So yeah, one of my learnings from my previous work as well as from this research is that one neat thing about local governments is that they learn from each other. And one of the best ways to help them learn from each other faster at the rate of technology is to make sure that their learnings are shared centrally. And so what I did was, as I aggregated this information to try to understand the policies myself, I made sure that was open and openly available to the community of practitioners, including local government officials. I also researched a number of best practice frameworks and really connecting the dots between policy language and best practice recommendations, at least from my discussions with local practitioners, is a valuable thing because, if you're a city official and you have a lot of different hats that you wear and you need to kind of set up a program for responsibly receiving de-identified information from a company in order to make sure that certain regulations are enforced or public interests are protected, you need to make sure that you are implementing those best practices.
Yeah, just as a single example.
And so I would say
you can go to your hub and find how other municipalities or local governments have wrestled with that same issue.
Exactly right. So one of the things that has emerged is the need to for cities collecting information that can include granular location information to protect and handle that information appropriately and make sure that the use of that information is limited only to a specific government purpose. And so if you click on my best practice guidance, you can see some of the specific pointers around those things. And for instance, around limiting and stating a government purpose and limiting collection to that purpose, you might be directed towards San Jose's principles for handling mobility information and be able to look directly at their language, download that, and reuse that language.
So a perfect example of the kinds of things these fellows are doing, which is creative, but also useful and highly relevant. So Steve's Hub, congratulations. It's a great, great invention.
Thank you.
Okay, Francella Ocello. She surveyed the impact of the digital divide and digital inequities on marginalized communities, focusing on three big issues, among others, education, housing, and workforce development, and made also some very practical recommendations for policymakers to deal with this, which is one of the central issues of our time. And it is reflected by and really challenged by technological change. So very important frontier for us. Francella.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for the introduction, my work, Secretary Carter, and also thank you to all the people behind the TAPP program that make our projects, allow them to come to life. When I set out to do research on digital inequities and how it intersects with income inequality, I actually didn't originally set out to identify its impact on marginalized communities. However, what I found when we looked at the 10 richest and the 10 poorest states, we showed consistently that it had the most disparate impact on marginalized communities. And so the key takeaways of my work, just to maybe reduce it to 2 or 3 points, are that when we are thinking about how we got to where we are on the digital divide, number one, it's a man-made construct that is complicated and will take time to untangle. But to your point that you mentioned earlier about at the beginning of the internet's introduction into US households, the government's decision not to create regulations and not to do certain public policy interventions are things that are now catching up with us. And that also affected who got access to digital, who had digital access, who had internet in their homes versus having to have public access. And also the other background point that we have yet as a country to actually decide that every single person deserves internet access as a right. And that is something that even the United Nations decided back in 2016. So we're still grappling with the lopsided policies, the monopolistic principles that we haven't really gotten away from in a telephone era. Those things were adopted into how broadband was regulated, and that affected deployment and really determining who had access to not only internet in their homes, but really thinking about who has the tools, the digital literacy, and people who are able to turn that access into opportunities for wealth. And so, and I do, as a last point, want to point out, the reason why I wanted to talk about it related to income is that it's really difficult for us to cut at some of the most pressing societal problems that we have without really cutting at how these things are related to cycles of poverty. And so if we want to reduce the cost of social services, if we want to change how much we are spending on how government provides government services, we need to also think about who has access to those things online. And then also, as we think about the larger, more exciting pieces about who has access to creating innovation and thinking about the challenges that we're going to face in 30 and 40 and 50 years, we have an opportunity to decide who are those digital architects now, and that begins with people having reliable access.
So Francella, you're going to move on and do some other things, but if you were going to have another year as a fellow, what does the future hold in this field? What's the next important area of investigation and invention for people who are interested in this area of technology? Well, I think we all are interested in this area of technological change. What's next?
I think 2 parts. Number one, I think that it's important for us to shift from a reactive policymaking footing to actually being proactive about deciding what exactly do we want in terms of who has access, who gets to be a digital architect. We have to affirmatively make those decisions and craft not only our investments, but also our public policies to actually achieve those goals. And then secondly, when I think about the next frontier, I think a lot about how we study health. And if nothing else, the digital divide is something that existed decades before the pandemic. It's only something that became obvious to a wide amount of people during the pandemic. And when we think about the fact that there are no longitudinal studies to show how digital poverty affects all sorts of aspects of your life, I think it's really important for us to start documenting what does it mean to not have access or only have marginal access in various cycles of your life, because that has a direct impact not only on your income, your education, your workforce and workforce opportunities and economic mobility, but also your opportunity to do one thing I want to hammer home. Your opportunity to buy your first house is the biggest opportunity for generational wealth in the United States. That is where the most amount of people get their first piece of generational wealth that is passed on. And half of those people are going to be some of the same who don't get that opportunity are the people who are most affected by the digital divide, because they don't have, very often those are the people who end up being renters and don't get those long-term opportunities at investments and other they don't have the same generational opportunities as other people on the upper echelons of the income ladder. So
Wow.
I do want to think about how we think about longitudinally, how does it affect people in the same way we can pinpoint if you were born in a certain zip code and born into a household at a certain income, you can actually estimate someone's life cycle. That some of that work was actually just proven also in a Harvard publication this past weekend.
It's just so impressive that these issues that are so difficult in conceptually to get your arms around, you in a very practical way just managed to wrestle them to the ground. I mean, using the same technology that constitutes the digital divide, kind of jujitsuing it against itself. Really impressive work, and look forward to watching your future chapters. Okay, Aviv Ovadia. He's been looking at this critical dynamic of the behavior of algorithms, which govern what the ebb and flow of information and attention is, as we all stare at our phones for several hours a day. And he's been looking down in the engine room of those algorithms and trying to think of ways that they could be improved in the spirit of public purpose. We all know that some of them, at least some of the time, are exploitative and harmful, including to children. So there are lots of ways that the compelling nature of the information served up by these algorithms, interacts with fundamental human nature and creates real challenges for all of us in our individual lives, but also as we think about our children, as we think about our political space, and so forth. So Aviv, you've been looking at the down in the engine room here and thinking and reimagining ways that this could be done differently. What have you found and what can you recommend?
Yeah, thanks for the excellent introduction. And as you said, my work focuses on our digital platforms, our communication platforms. And I guess my primary sort of lens there is on thinking about democracy and division, and those algorithmic recommendation systems and the governance around them. And so I'm guided by this thesis that our communication technologies shouldn't by nature divide us. They should be trying to facilitate, they should be built in a way, in the same way that we try to build so many other aspects of our environment to facilitate understanding, trust, wise decision-making. Like that should be our North Star. I want to ensure that they support these sort of better angels of our nature instead of that sort of devil on our shoulders. And also they don't support those actors who seek to divide us. And like these recommendation systems, they matter so much. I mean, we're producing trillions of gigabytes of data each year, and they're allocating our attention. And so the real thing that they're doing is they're determining what is rewarded by society at large, because that attention that they direct translates directly to money, power, and status. And so they're determining that reward structure for society. And right now, what they're rewarding in many ways is conflict. They're rewarding people who are seeking to divide us, what Amanda Ripley calls conflict entrepreneurs. And that has tremendous impacts, not just in terms of the ideas of algorithmic amplification, where it's, oh, they're directing our attention in ways that are gonna hurt the consumers of that content, but also in terms of the production itself, like what is actually produced, who produces it, who gains power within society. It's going to be the people who are creating outrage, sensationalism, misinformation. And so how do we shift that? And what I've settled on is what I'm sort of describing as bridging based ranking. And so the default that we think about is for how platforms work is engagement based ranking. And that means that basically the things that get the most attention get the most get shown the most as a result. And there's these really unfortunate feedback loops, given the way that we just naturally respond to the psychology of like things that might harm us, we're going to pay more attention to. But there are ways to instead reward the types of content and behavior that actually lead to positive interactions across diverse groups and including around divisive topics. And that's like something that was technically challenging in some ways, but we've now seen baby steps in that direction. And so I'm working on both from the policy side, like what does that look like? What are the potential reservations around that? How do we overcome them? But also on the technical side, like what are the open problems? Like we already can do this a bit in various ways. What are the blockers? What are the actual really deep technical things? We want to do this really well. We want to ensure that these algorithmic recommendation systems actually are rewarding those who bridge divides over those who seek to divide us. And so that's been sort of the crux of that work. And then there's also work around how do we govern these systems more generally? Not just what is rewarded, but who decides?
I think one of the things that I've learned a lot from talking with you and watching your work is the variety. We don't have to do everything one way. There doesn't have to be one ecosystem. And it has seemed to me for some time that the way ahead in this whole algorithm and the style of social media is to inject some diversity in it. It's so monochromatic in what it has stressed and emphasized, namely attention with the aim of advertising as the sole underlying motivation of so much of social media. And there, as you have pointed out, lots of other ways to construct things so that draw out different dimensions of human nature. And so one of the ideas that's been attractive to me is to have diversity in that ecosystem. I've talked about there being many channels, but one of the things I've learned from you is, how to populate that idea. And lots of variety very quickly now, because we got to move on in all these subjects we could talk about all day. Give me 60 seconds on where you go next, where you go next with these ideas.
Yeah, so one of the things I've been pointing to is sort of the bright spots, the little things like a Twitter or Facebook is doing that are sort of in this general direction, but really it's like pushing resources toward this, like building up those open problems, directing energy from researchers, funders, platforms, governments really toward that space, and ensuring that even as we let's say develop a diversity of mechanisms here, that we're ensuring that we're not creating this sort of competition to the race to the bottom around attention, because I think that is one of the real risks here. And so we really want to be careful not to create competition for the things that actually get the most attention when we're aiming for for potentially diversity, and what is the baseline, and how do we create that baseline so that everything can stay above that baseline and sort of help bring us across those divides.
Very, very, very good point. And it's interesting as I think we're going to demand more of the big platforms. They're going to make the argument, and they're starting to make this argument already, that only at their scale can the platforms like this be self-regulated in a good way, and that if we begin breaking them up, there'll be a Wild West sequel to that scenario. I myself have some doubts about that, but I've heard that concern articulated, and including, importantly, and very intelligently by you. So thank you, Aviv. Afsaneh Rigaud has developed something that she calls designing from the margins, which is a really interesting idea. It challenges us to think about how we would design from the start with an eye to what she refers to as high risk, low probability scenarios. We all look at things around us, and the internet's one of them, that if we could start all over again and we're designing it from scratch, we would never have designed it the way we did. So for example, what I have in mind when I say that is, if you were going to redo the internet, you would not have an internet as vulnerable to cyber attack and manipulation as ours is. So if we could start all over, we would not design it the way we did. We designed it with the idea that everybody who was on it was kind of a good-natured, researchy type person. And now that's far from true, but we have the underlying mechanisms and protocols that make the whole thing more vulnerable than it should be. So Afsaneh has been thinking about designing from the beginning with a different set of motivations in mind than what I just talked about in cybersecurity, but the principle's the same. And she calls it, and I like this phrase, designing from the margins. Afsaneh, tell us about designing from the margins and what it is and how we can apply it.
Oh, thank you, Secretary Carter. Yes, I've had the opportunity, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to try and form this methodology and concept out throughout this fellowship, which kind of tries to challenge, especially currently, our communication technologies, to look at the way they're designing tools away from these sort of move fast, break things concepts of we just want to scale out, but rather looking at the biggest harms and scenarios that could be perpetuated against individuals and contexts, and build from those. And the reason for that is that we're seeing, you know, as everyone in this panel and whoever else is interested in the topic of tech and society, we're seeing like this amplified, varied, and just overwhelming amount of harms, human rights abuses, and other issues via technologies. And there's this necessity to look at the way we are actually designing and developing the technologies that makes them susceptible to different types of manipulation and weaponization. Like you mentioned at the beginning, there are certain technologies that are by design harmful, discriminatory, and created in a way that creates these sort of issues, but there are certain technologies that have gaping holes within them that can be manipulated for whether it's cybersecurity or safety. And this design from the margins, one trying to call on these designers, technologists, and other types of builders to think about from ideation this point of the most quote unquote extremes, what could be the most harm that could come about, create based on them. And also this call that the way we're creating our technologies can't be divorced from the real issues of political, legal, and social impacts on individuals' lives. So understanding those broader concepts that impact lives and create risks and harms also helps these teams understand who becomes most harmed or at risk to start to design from. So that's what I've been developing. And I think the really interesting part of all of this has been pointing out to folks that a lot of industries do develop and create based on the extreme scenarios. You know, if we're talking about industrial engineering or the way we're creating our buildings and so on. In the panel we had yesterday, we gave the example of earthquakes. We're not going to be creating based on like the most best. We don't want our buildings to be created for the best weather conditions. We want them to sustain for the worst that could come. Why aren't we doing that for our technologies? And the reason this also becomes really fundamental is that from a corporate responsibility angle, a lot of the moves in my field from human rights and other different arenas that have come to kind of push for reduction in harms and mitigation have failed in different ways, because the way the technology in itself has been built has so many gaping holes in it. So trying to push at least the narrative, at least a new method of thinking to try and bring about a change in the structure of how we're engineering and designing things has been the starting point from this fellowship that I'm very excited to push for after.
Well, I think it's just a very, very creative approach, and it reinforces something, Afsane, that we have been trying to do in TAPP, as you know, which is to tell technologists themselves that they need to get in the game and be part of the creation of solutions. Don't leave it to regulators, to business leaders, and so forth only. Technologists get in the game, and you're challenging designers basically to start with public good as a design criterion. And start there. And it's a wonderful challenge and a wonderful promise. So look forward to future chapters in your development of the concept of design from the margin. Last word is going to be from Livio Valenti. Livio has been looking at how the US federal government organizes itself to make investments aimed at increasing the technological prowess of the country for its own development, and also for competitive purposes, and also for public missions like national defense or health or other things that we regard as appropriate missions of the government. For all those reasons, promoting technology is one of the central jobs of the government. But the question is how? And if you take money, what do you do with it? And he's been looking at the institutional homes for research and development sponsored by government, and made some really interesting observations on how we can build on some of the institutions that we've inherited from the past and create a new infrastructure for the future. Livio, tell us what you found.
Thank you, Secretary Carter. I think the first question that we start asking ourselves was, where does innovation come from, and where does technology come from? Because we are surrounded by technological tools and things that have been developed somewhere. So we start asking this question of, how do we find the most advanced sorts of new technology that are developed today, and they might be very early, they might take a long time to be developed, but nonetheless are under development. So what we did, we tried to map out all the R&D hubs. Where does all the R&D come from? So we look at university labs, we look at private labs, and then we look at government labs, and we look at how the government is able to continue to finance and invest in this early stage research and development. And then we look at the translation piece. Translation meaning, how does technology transition from those labs into our iPhone batteries or our GPS system or things that we might need and they will continue to serve us to advance as a society. And I think we developed a tool for entrepreneurs, people like me that work with scientists to translate some of their scientific discoveries into new ventures. And we developed this tool by talking with a lot of commercialization offices in different national labs, in different government labs and university labs, and trying to provide a blueprint for those entrepreneurs to launch companies alongside scientists. And we found that there is an incredible wealth of technological advancement that are sitting in those labs, but most of the time are not becoming product and services, and even less time are able to have an impact on something that is really meaningful, like advancing human health, defending us from the next pandemics. And we all look at some of the success cases, like the mRNA, for example, being one of those things that was developed with a lot of government funding, and we're able to appreciate the potentials of translational science. And there's still a lot of work to be done, but we're lucky to have so much scientific innovation in those labs that people can now much more easily translate into product and service that can help us to advance as a society.
Livia, I think the people talk a lot about the valley of death, which is the valley between research on the one hand and doing something on the other. And people who've worked on innovation have long tried to bridge that valley. But there's another valley, and the one you're talking about, between research done by and for public purposes and its ability to transition to affect the larger society and the larger economy. That's another really important valley. And as long as governments have been trying to contribute to the innovative effort, they've been trying to figure out how to fill that valley. And the work you've done, the examples you've looked at, and the recommendations you've made are really important. I think that's one of the principal challenges that we face today as we try to think about how societies that are organized like ours can compete with a statist model in which the government does everything. That's not our model. And so you're trying to make what is private and what is public meet together seamlessly and function. And that's a critical question for whether our system with its values can be competitive in today's world. So in a sense, you're working on the most important dimension of political philosophy and geopolitics as it affects the innovative enterprise. So really excellent work, very, very creative. I encourage everybody to get a hold of some of Livio's work or get a hold of him and listen to what he has to say. We've come to the witching hour now, so all of these subjects are so interesting, we could go on. I'm going to turn things for closing to my colleague, Amritha Jayanti. Thanks again very much to all of these amazing, these fellows. It has been a privilege and a joy to work with you over the last year and to watch your ideas grow and bear fruit.
Thank you so much, Secretary Carter. And thank you to our TAPP Fellows for a very interesting discussion and display of their work. I don't know if you all want to actually turn your cameras back on, but you all have accomplished so much this year, and this week is meant to elevate that and celebrate that. So as mentioned, we have a lot of individual events. If you missed the events from yesterday, they're recorded and will be posted online soon. We have 2 more events today, 2 more events tomorrow. So we really encourage you all to sign up and learn more about the work that our fellows have done. So you can track our events and publications through our Twitter as well, which is at @TAPP_project. So thanks again to the audience for attending. Thanks to our fellows. Thanks to Secretary Carter. Thanks to Karen for coordinating all of this and working so much with our fellowship program. So we look forward to seeing you all at upcoming events. Thank you. Bye.